In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right, Sublation Magazine readers, Sublation Media viewers, all you people out there waiting for socialism, it's me again, Douglas Lain.
And I'm Ashley Frawley, your trusty sidekick.
You're not my sidekick. You're my co-host and co-equal, Ashley. We are back again this week. This time, we're going to be discussing, instead of the sexual revolution, we're going to tackle a broader subject, the human subject, or whether or not there are human subjects left. What do we think of this idea of subjectivity? What is it to be a reasonable, rational person and human agent in the world, and so on and so forth. But before we begin, I should tell everybody, click all the buttons, subscribe to our channel, go to Patreon and support us. Let's see what else. Press the like button, leave a comment, and so on and so forth. It does help us when you do all those things. But Ashley, I feel as though you are the expert on defending the human subject. So I want to let you set the frame for this conversation.
Ever so slightly terrifying.
Also, before we begin, though, I told you this off air. I want to tell you this now. You look snazzy. You're color coordinated. The lamp shade, the painting, and your blouse or shirt there, all color coordinated. It couldn't be better. I'm going to get a painting in a blouse like that, I think.
I was thinking, one kind of like uncharted territory is I should do some hair tutorials. Like, this took me 6 hours. Not that anybody would want to repeat like the tiniest 6 hours to get the tiniest little hint of the rainbow in the sunlight.
Oh no, it looks so nice though. It's worth it. It's worth it.
This is my stupid hobbies. When I have time, or at least when my mother-in-law takes the kids, I turn on a podcast. I listen to Diet Soap, which I've been listening to for, I don't know, since, how long have you been doing it? I think I've been listening since 2008.
Wow.
And I dye my hair and I yell at the phone. I yell at the podcast. No, blah, blah, blah.
I started Diet Soap in 1957, but no, 2008, 2009, I think is when it started, around 2009, actually.
Yeah, so that's my hobby. It's a sad life. Anyways, so on the topic of the open subject is what I like to think about it. I think of what it means to be a human, I suppose. What it means to be human in society is open, is incredibly variable, and it would be very, very difficult to pin down what would be like, the whole nature versus nurture debate. But it'd be very difficult to pin down what nature would be, because there's no such thing as a human that lives entirely outside of society and, acquires language and is able to express their true self outside of society. This doesn't exist. When you are raised outside of society, there are all sorts of things that people take for granted as natural, like bringing food to your face. I mean, like children who've been unfortunately subject to extreme forms of neglect, like, locked in a room for 10 years or something like that, they don't acquire language and, don't even bring food to your face. Like, that's the extent to which human beings are a product of socialization. And I say that not in the sense of like a deterministic sense where we are just products, we just, a conduit for things. Obviously, it's a back and forth process, but the extent to which human beings are part of society is enormous, whereas it's more than any other species on the planet. And it's amazing to me when people kind of talk about animals like, oh, well, we're just a bunch of animals and we're really not so different from blah blah blah. Crows seem to have some form of communication. Like, it's just astonishing how that people can say that and not appreciate how much society is part of who we are and who we become as individuals. The paradox of the individual is that you are an individual only in society. Only through an active and selective engagement with the culture that you eventually call your own can you really become an individual in the sense that we understand it now. And in our highly socialized societies, that is, where the means of production are not something that when I say socialized, I don't mean obviously we own the means of production. Obviously, they're taken away from us, and they're owned by other people, but it's taken care of. Reproducing our existence is, we take a small part of it, but the division of labor means that you don't have to think about a huge range of things that go into your day. Like, I don't know who made this mug, and I don't know who made the coffee in it.
Whoever they are, though, they should be in gulag.
My husband, it's warm and cozy. My husband actually made that coffee for me. But like, I don't know who it is that, did the processing and all these sorts of things. But this then frees you to be able to do all sorts of things, to become an individual in society. The fact that we have a division of labor, the fact that so much is taken over by other people in society in interconnected ways that we often fail to appreciate. This is what allows us to be an individual, or to be individuals, to be more individual than perhaps we have ever been. And this is a product of our particular period in historical development. Subjectivity is very much open. The fact that we have like existential crises now is a product of our particular circumstances. Like 1,000 years ago, you wouldn't have said like, gosh, at age like 16, who am I? What am I going to be? What is my purpose in life? You wouldn't have done that. You would have known these things because you would have, saw how your parents lived, and you would have more or less lived their lives. As Christopher Lasch says, most people did not live. In fact, I think I often attribute this quote to Christopher Lasch, but recently I looked it up, and it might not be Lasch. But anyways, I think it was Christopher Lasch who said, most people did not live as though they had one life to live. They lived as though they were living their parents' lives and their children's lives. And now we don't live like that, right? We are more and more set adrift. And in many ways, this is quite bad, but in many ways, it's freeing. You wouldn't, as a woman, I am not tied to, my family in a way that I would have been in the past, where that role would have been more or less decided for me, and I would have had little choice outside of that. It's a freeing thing. It's also quite alienating, and whatever frees us turns around and starts to control us at the end of the day, as well, as we talked about last week, where this idea of like liberation is only to be achieved through the marketplace for women then gets used against women, and we talked about this in the Patreon, actually, where it's led to this sort of individuation among family members, where the family becomes conceived of, or families become conceived of, more and more in antagonistic terms. So like, the children are a draw on the mother when she really wants to be in the workplace, and equality is only to be achieved in the workplace, not necessarily through the full range of choices, but you must be integrated into the workplace. That's what's going to fuel economic growth, and so on. I mean, that's a freeing thing, the fact that we are able to do that, but at the same time, now you're kind of only supposed to do that, and other ways of, the welfare state has been pulled back in terms of all sorts of different supports for people to kind of push women into work. So that's like the only really viable option, and it's pushed women into precarious work, into work with antisocial hours, flexibility, when it's actually quite family unfriendly, flexible work policies. But anyways, nonetheless, it's important to understand that developments have a negative side as well as a positive side. So just because something is a product of capitalism doesn't necessarily mean it's wholly a bad thing. It can have a good thing too, but we have to kind of be aware of the sorts of things that integrate us more into capitalism, and the sorts of things that maybe we can use to push back or push forward into a different kind of future. But anyways, all of this is a very roundabout way of saying that, what it means to be human is not determined by our biology. It's determined by an incredibly complex array of forces that then come to seem natural and feed back into our ideas of what is natural.
Well, I wanted to the first thing is to kind of underscore is that the story you just told, or the explanation you just gave, is contradictory, right? I mean, which isn't to indict it, but on the one hand, the development of the division of labor through industrial production, and the development along with that of market capitalism, or just capitalism, has created a situation where we are individuals in a way that we were not in the past. We are free in a way that we were not in the past. You mentioned, we might have an existential crisis today at 16, wondering what we're going to do with our lives. That would not have been a problem for people in the Middle Ages. And so there's that. But then on the other hand, you mentioned the limitations on that freedom that arise. And you gave the example of women being free only in the direction of becoming wage workers, or perhaps now also becoming like managers or politicians.
And of course, not to overstate, it's not that you only do that. Yes, there's a degree of choice available, and many women do sort of take that choice, which is why we get a lot of part-time work and a gender pay gap that starts to emerge once women have children. So I don't want to like sort of overstate that, but yes, that's the idea, at least for as far
right.
as
when you choose,
concern is to push women more into the marketplace, to integrate women into the market as a means of achieving equality.
Yeah, when you choose not to become a worker, you are abdicating your responsibility towards freedom. That's how it's. When people criticize women for being stay-at-home mothers, that's what they're criticizing them for.
Exactly.
So what I've been reading Russell Jacoby's book on social amnesia, which is it's kind of a defense of Freud and not only from those who would call him unscientific and just want to completely walk away from psychoanalysis, but also from some of those who would claim to be taking up the psychoanalytic tradition. And I won't go too far into who those people are or what his critique of them is, but one of the things that Russell Jacoby says is that the most radical aspect of Freud's thought is the thing that many on the left want to deny or repress or escape. And that is the idea that we are run by internal drives, that we have an unconscious, we are based on our biology, and that we are reactive creatures. And the reason why this should be taken up by socialists as the most radical insight that Freud has to offer is because what that means for socialists is that we have not yet developed into free individuals, that we are still reactive creatures because of the way society is dominating us and dominating what I'll call our second nature.
Okay.
We have this nature that we begin with, which is, maybe based in our lizard brain or something
right.
like that.
Okay.
Right. And then we develop through culture and language and symbols a second nature, but we are dominated on both terrains at the moment. We don't, and that leads us to become unconscious beings, to not quite be fully individual. So that's when Marxists take up the problem of postmodernity, or just when Marxists take up Freud, two completely different things in a lot of ways. This is what they're trying to take up. With postmodernity, it's the problem of a flattened, very limited, ahistorical society.
Okay.
That's the postmodern society. And when Marxists take up Freud, they take up the fact that we are mostly motivated by unconscious drives, unconscious feelings, unconscious symbols or symptoms, and have not yet developed the room socially for self-reflection and self-direction that should be the aim of communism.
Well, I think that the legacy of that desire to take up Freud is partially rooted in a internal questioning that happened in the post-war period, where the fabled revolution never occurred, and there was a need to explain why it hadn't. And we've covered this ground a lot before, but I'll repeat it. I think that they turned the lens toward the people. So they were duped by processes within capitalism that played on their lizard brains or whatever. It's obviously a caricature of the argument, but you see what I'm trying to say. That the general kind of thrust has been to kind of explain why there was no revolution, and to say, well, because capitalism has been so good at manipulating people. But to respond to that, I have a little bit in my forthcoming book where I kind of go through Marx on this. So if human beings can use reason to understand the forces of history, Marx thought, they can control them. So reason is important because human beings can understand the forces of history and in doing so control them. And they can do this because they're both the subject and the object of revolutionary processes. History itself had produced new subjects in the present and will continue to do so in the future. That is, humanity and workers specifically had made the world and are products of it. As Marx argued in an 1856 speech, we know that to work well, the newfangled forces of present society, I added the word present there, but that's what he meant, they only want to be mastered by newfangled men, and such are the working men. There is much the invention of modern time as machinery itself. Now that's kind of the same idea that you're putting forward, that capitalism has produced a particular subject. But you notice the difference in tone. The idea is that this subject that was produced by capitalism for Marx was a very optimistic thing. And he was responding to this idea, I think, implicitly at least, that, we need new people to create a new world. And he says, no, we've already created a new world and it's mastered and we only need to master it. And the new people have already been created. They're already here. They already master the machines. All they need to do is become conscious of it and turn it to their will. And so it's the same argument, but there's a pessimistic tinge to the one that you've put forward, which is that, yes, capitalism has created these new people and they're all bad. and they will never have a revolution until we can kind of overcome this. I think, and maybe I'm putting words into your mouth.
No. Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're putting words in my mouth. And part of me, my first thought is that I want to embrace that pessimism. Don't take my pessimism away from me. But, I don't think this part is fair, that we didn't fail the people as communists. People failed us as revolutionary subjects. I don't believe that we can look back on history and say, oh, everything that was needed was in place. The leadership understood, the communists, the Second International, the Third International, they all had it figured out. They didn't make mistakes. What went wrong was that the stupid masses didn't fall in line. That is not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that including the leadership, including the people in the Second International, there was a bourgeois ideology that developed that is difficult to get beyond. The bourgeois subject is not the same as the revolutionary subject, but it has to be the basis or the foundation for the revolutionary subject, which is a difficult.
Well, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by the bourgeois subject?
I mean, the subject which takes for granted the property relations, the social relations, the division of labor that has set up the kind of freedom that we know now.
Okay, well, let's just
say that it's the limit of their horizon, and that would include people who own capital, the actual bourgeoisie, or the working class. It doesn't, your actual class position informs, but is not completely determinative of what your ideological perspective is. So,
but let's say we did take seriously the bourgeois subjectivity as something that believes in property relations and I don't know what else, democracy, right? Bourgeois democracy. I mean, capitalism destroys that, right? So this is the famous line from the Communist Manifesto. They accuse us of wanting to do with private property, but capitalism has already done away with private property for 9 times the population. So if you take that seriously and you say, well, we've got a world to win, it's that the contradiction is that by abolishing private property, everybody has everything, right? Like capitalism abolishes private property and leaves you with nothing. And yet in front of you is a whole world of wealth. And you're told that you can't have it, but you're looking at it and you're like, okay, but it's clearly there, it's clearly available, and we're like burning it and blowing it up and wasting it and so on. And people kind of see that contradiction and they say, well, I want it, right? So I think there are aspects of bourgeois subjectivity that are even bourgeois subjectivity that are kind of that have a progressive edge to them, because capitalism abolishes its own progressive nature. Like that's the idea that these it was progressive. Bourgeois society was progressive for its time, but what was once a productive and progressive force becomes a fetter on further progress, even in its own direction. So
it becomes a fetter on further progress, but it also becomes the basis for the material wealth that we see in the world.
Yeah.
So like you see the abundance of society, but all of that abundance is founded upon and is reproduced by the laboring classes working in, in a particular way as wage laborers producing commodities and so forth. And there is no alternative social organization to produce the kind of abundance that we witness under capitalism in place.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very easy when you are reliant upon commodity production, as even workers are, to see commodity production as natural, as reified,
Mm-hmm.
as a limit of what's possible. Everything has to be done in relationship to that. So to get to a radical politics of social transformation of the way we produce the world, it is incredibly difficult, especially when you take into account, and not just difficult for working class people who are rank and file participants in a labor movement. It's difficult for the leaderships of that movement. It's difficult for the people who are trying to form a party to conceive of a politics that truly goes beyond this, what is.
Yeah, I would say, like, I think real bourgeois subjectivity is never what people think it is. Like, there's always like this caricature where it's like, oh, that's what capitalism wants you to do. And they don't realize that capitalism is kind of like it is an ever-changing kind of force. And so they'll be like, oh, capitalism wants you to consume. No, it does not want you to consume. As a worker, it wants you to be ascetic. It wants you not to consume, to be satisfied on as little as your boss is willing to give you. It wants the workers of another country to be profligate, not you. And I think real bourgeois subjectivity, that is subjectivity that is in line with the needs of capitalism, is a subjectivity that is willing to moderate desires and demands in accordance with the needs of capitalism, with its limits, and to see those limits as natural, and to naturalize them and to reify them. So I think, like, who loves environmentalism the most in the UK? Who's like the big kind of environmentalist people? So bad. I'm sorry for using this example. It's like Prince Charles. Who else? Very, very rich people love this. And it's not the kind of environmentalism where it's like, no, like through understanding these problems, we can figure out how to solve them, perhaps through like technological progress. I think that's like, okay, it's a limit, but us, through our human ingenuity, we can push beyond that. I think that's the progressive kind of idea. The bourgeois idea is, oh, there's a limit, we must hold back. Moderate your demands, moderate your desires. How dare you demand more when the world is burning, the world is falling apart? That is it. There's a limit. Capitalism imposes a limit. Look, we can't do this profitably. And you go, oh, that's just natural. That's just the limits of humanity, and how it's hubris to push beyond that. I think the real radical and revolutionary kind of approach is seeing a limit and demanding that we go beyond it. And capitalism is constantly saying, no, this is it. We can't go, end economic growth. That was part of the thing that confused me and made me want to do a PhD on that, was like, why are these well-to-do people who are very much enveloped in the logic of capitalism, economists, very rich people, why are they arguing that there are limits to growth, that society should not carry on any further, that we should move towards steady state societies. And I went back through history and I could see John Stuart Mill saying the same thing long before there was an environmental justification. And not just John Stuart Mill, but many of the early classical economists saw a point in which growth would end, and internal to capitalism. Now we see that as an external thing, as external limits to growth. But at the time, it was an internal thing, the falling rate of profit. They could see that there was an end point. But someone like John Stuart Mill, who naturalized the present order, saw it as he naturalized it. He said it's a stationary state to which capitalism is tending, and it will create an equilibrium. But Marx was like, no, that's not an equilibrium. It's a destructive force. It's a destructive tendency within capitalism, and it leads us to a point in which we must move beyond capitalism. And so this is bourgeois ideology. Is this every time there's a limit? This is why I like to call myself a libertarian, a libertarian communist, and just kind of to piss people off. And that's because I'm more libertarian than libertarians, because when they see a limit to, or people who are like very much, pro-capitalist, when they see a limit, they see it as a limit of humanity. They're like, no, human beings mustn't do that. And if it's like comes into contradiction with the functioning of capitalist society, they're fine with forgetting about human freedom. They're all for human freedom when it comes to like very specific things that are within capitalism. But if it's like any kind of human freedom beyond that, they're perfectly happy to do away with civil rights and that sort of thing. This is like the quintessential liberal that flips over into a fascist. They're liberal, and there's a split. I'm talking about Ishai Landa now, if anybody's interested. But Ishai Landa says he's not the only one to say this, but there's a split between political liberalism and economic liberalism. And these two things come into contradiction. And those who are pro-capitalist, as soon as there is a contradiction between political liberalism and economic liberalism, they jettison political liberalism. They're like, no, you can't have freedoms. Forget that, because they come into contradiction with the economy. But I think a true revolutionary subject sees that contradiction and demands we go further, demands we see it through. Like we demand our democratic say in how we run the world, even if it means that we have to move beyond capitalism. We demand, continuing to have a better than decent standing of living for everyone, even if that creates, they start screaming, no, inflation. You go, I don't care, that's your problem, not mine. And you demand more. Or they say, no, if workers demand too much, there'll be capital flight. And you go, okay, then we'll escalate when we get there. You just keep demanding more. And every time they tell you to stop, you keep going. I think the kind of real bourgeois subjectivity is the one that says, no, this is it. This is the end. This is human nature. This is all there ever will be. And how dare you piddly little humans, think that you could possibly move beyond this and have something else or control the world.
I want to jump in.
Over the economy. Sorry.
Okay. In May of 1968, the slogan on the streets, one of them, this is in Paris, and during the student worker uprising, one of the slogans was "Demand the impossible." Be realistic, demand the impossible.
I remember that
slogan. And so when it comes to growth, right? The reason people oppose growth now and want to put external limits on growth usually has to do with concerns around the environment, the way in which we're materially transforming the world, and in a relatively mindless way, because there's only one aspect of production that we really focus upon, which is the amount of labor time that's embodied in commodities, just quantifiable aspect of it. And overall, I would say that the demand for further and further growth, if taken up as the only demand, and framed by bourgeois ideology, won't lead us to transforming society. It will only become an impossible demand in the same way that a demand for fair wages might be an impossible demand. You're not going to be able to get perpetual, endless growth because of the tendency of the rate of profit to decline. And further, the kind of growth you're going to get will be severely limited. It could, you can get endless growth through or at least what looks like endless growth through the repressing of interest rates and the increasing of financialization. And
No,
then
you won't
have
get endless growth that way, but you can get the appearance of growth for a short period of time.
you can, a very massive growth, through that kind of thing. And we've seen that as the way we came out of the 2008 crisis was precisely through the demand and the acceptance of the demand to grow by growing the money supply. So we have to be specific by what we mean when we say growth. Like you have to say, okay, well, the growth of human power and understanding and ability is what we should be looking for, rather than the quantifiable growth that we can see in dollars.
No. I mean material growth. And it
look,
and it's certainly
but
something
dollars and cents is not material necessarily.
No, I'm not saying material growth in the sense of like print more money and have dollars and cents and do stock buybacks and all that kind of thing. I mean material growth in the sense of you promised us that capitalism was the superior system because it increased our living standards indefinitely. So give me that, please. And when you tell me, and that this is what I tell my children too, when they're like concerned about, children live in this moneyless world. And they're like, well, why do we even need money? And I'm like, because money gives us freedom, at least in this world. A certain amount of material comfort gives us security. And the bourgeoisie enjoy that. And we want, this is, James Connolly, our demands most moderate are, we only want the earth. What we want, what they command from birth. They get this security. They get to to a certain extent, they're always sort of pursued by this fear of losing everything. They can't stand still for half a second, which is true. But there's a certain amount of security that wealth brings within capitalism that we demand, that we will not pay for crises. We will not pay we will not live with uncertainty in a world in which it is possible to give everyone a good standard of living. We have the capability to do that, and we must demand that. We must demand material progress in the sense of sharing in the technological innovations that make life easier for people. That, because we don't have to pound our flour, we just get bread and it's fairly cheap. And yet some people in the world do. That saps a huge amount of life out of people. That's like how many hours you spend like having to go and get water, or how many hours do you have to spend, reproducing your existence? Where we take that for granted. I think a lot of people will romanticize poverty and a closeness to the earth in reproducing your own existence through your daily toil or whatever. But the fact that we have moved beyond that has given us an enormous amount of freedom to decide what we will do, even to romanticize that. We have the freedom to romanticize poverty because we don't live in it anymore, like for the most part. You don't have, in the Western world, you don't have to spend most of your life like pounding millet and grain and stuff. And yet some people do. And now this is a demand that we share out that progress with everyone because it's possible.
Okay, so I want to step back and say, look, obviously you're not going to find any argument for me about what's positive about technological development or the demand for better lives, or
for real. That's what I want. Like
everyone can get a rocket ship. I would
one day we will. I picture Star Trek. And
I would want a friend along with the rocket ship. I should also get some sort of NASA scientist engineer, because I would not be competent to fly a rocket ship on my own. I'm barely competent behind the wheel of my station wagon.
But of course, you can fly your rocket ship in the evening and talk philosophy in the morning, as you have a mind to do, without needing to be a NASA engineer or a philosopher.
If I were to get a rocket ship, I would certainly want to make sure I got new glasses, because I have trouble seeing at night as it is with these. Okay, so I wanted to run this clip because I think that this debate about how transformed we are and how limited we are by the culture that develops out of capitalist relations is one that should be taken up again, because I feel as though, while you're not entirely wrong that the turn to Freud and the Frankfurt School philosophers and others were acting try in reaction to the failures of the 20th century. The other side of that is that there were failures in the 20th century.
That's what I was going to say. Like,
yeah.
I'm afraid of these things myself. Like, it's not like I sit there and go like, oh, revolution tomorrow. No, I don't know what comes next. Our attempts to overturn, an entire economic and social system have failed and produced really scary results. That scares me too.
So I want to run this clip from Rick Roderick. Whenever I'm in doubt, I just run a Rick Roderick clip. I'm not that much in doubt right now, but I'm going to run it anyway. Here we go.
I mean, in a certain way, one of the characteristics of what the self is, and one of the reasons it's under siege, is we're interpretive beings. And now, by the late 20th century, we're in a situation where interpretation has never been more difficult. Never been more difficult. I can name artifacts that we've developed technologically that are almost completely closed to interpretation, and I'll name one. Although we attempt to interpret it. Television. Television tries to interpret itself to us, bypassing the upper brain functions and directly feeding into our minds. This is why I said off camera between classes that Orwell was a pie-eyed optimist. 1984 arrived in sort of the early 70s, and Orwell's vision of a horrible future, which was a boot stomping on a human face forever, is a utopian image because he assumed there would be resistance and human faces, both of which may turn out to be false. So, 1984 is not a book that scares me anymore. It's again, I know that last time I outrageously said that Herbert Marcuse was the Norman Vincent Peale of the 60s. And now this time I've been forced to say that Orwell was an optimist, a sort of my corollary to his little cautionary tale.
So anyhow, there's that. What did you make of that? Was that can you find a way in to respond to Rick Roderick there, Ashley?
Yeah. I wrote down a point here that I think. I'm sympathetic to that kind of pessimism, I think, in my darker moments. But I think it's actually very difficult to get people to act against their own interests. People will say like, oh, people are voting against their own interests, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. If you look at like large numbers of people doing something, okay, a few people might do something stupid, but not hundreds of thousands. When there's an enormous trend, people are typically doing something in their own interests, even if those interests are short-sighted or, even if they're short-sighted. And so the question is then, what are those interests? And so that's why I can't stand, somebody said above in the comments, Ashley says the same things every week. And what's funny is that I used to be terrified of repeating myself. And so I would say something once and I'd never say it again. But I do repeat myself because not everybody watches every week, and it's worthwhile to make important points in different ways. So excuse me for repeating myself yet again. Now I forgot where I was going with that.
Let me just redirect you a little bit and maybe help you get back on track. The thing about the Rick Roderick clip is that Rick Roderick is not claiming that working class people are stupid or that they failed the revolution, but rather that something about modernity that modernity itself is such that it constrains our ability to interpret. It placates us. It turns off our minds and it interprets itself for us. And I just watched the movie Glass Onion. I'm going to be making a little.
Oh my God! I just watched it yesterday too.
Okay, great. So maybe we can discuss it. What I did ultimately decide I did not like the film.
Me too.
Yeah.
Great minds, Doug.
Yeah. For me, in the video I'm going to be making and started production on, I want to compare it to a Columbo episode. Any Columbo episode will do. I happen to pick the Bye Bye Sky High or Mile High IQ Club, something like that. where a super genius was part of a Mensa organization kills another super genius, and then little proletariat, average everyday man Columbo has to crack the case and outsmart the genius, which I thought was a nice reversal of the Glass Onion. But I think movies like The Glass Onion or even a show like White Lotus, which I started watching, tries to sell us on a vision of reality where the difficulties are about bad people who are maybe privileged and wealthy, or maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than encourage us to think and to not take a position of judging one, your fellow man so much as to trying to understand the larger situation. And one of the things about the Columbo episodes is that in order for him to solve the case, he has to take in the totality of evidence in the larger situation and put these things together. So, even though, I'm sure Adorno would look at Columbo and feel sick to his stomach, and that's a sign of the decline of Western civilization, and perhaps it still seems to me to be an improvement upon the slick Netflix original version of a detective story, which isn't a detective story at all. But what was your reaction to Glass Onion? What did you think of it?
Oh, well, just totally surface level, Doug. Jesus, now you've embarrassed me. I am so normie when it comes to my media tastes. It's purely escapism for me. No, it seemed to be the great thing about a detective story is the details, right? And so they have to be written very, very well, because as you said, you have to take in the totality.
Mm-hmm.
And every detail matters. And you can have red herrings and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But because people are encouraged to take in every detail, you have to be very careful. And they were not careful. And that annoyed the hell out of me. Because there's all this debate online about whether or not the plot holes are plot holes. And they definitely were plot holes. I know, because I like everything to be tied up in a neat little bow for me. I am, as I said, terribly normie. And it just wasn't, and they're just plot holes in this stupid story, and it just speaks to the fact that Netflix wanted to cash in on the original Knives Out, and did it really quickly with a flashy ensemble cast, and sacrificed elements of the story and the writing, which is cool.
Can you give me an example of a plot hole?
I don't want to ruin it for anybody, because people were saying, "Don't spoil it, don't spoil it."
Yeah, did I? I guess I kind of came close to spoiling it, didn't I? But I didn't.
Yeah. So I'll just say, like, sending the box at the beginning made no sense, and there's no way that you can explain it to make it sense. And I've looked at other people's explanations, and it just doesn't make sense. So that's
sending
one
the box. Okay, wait. I think we can talk about the boxes and not spoil
so
much. These are just the invitations to the murder.
The invitations to the murder mystery weekend were sent out to 5 people. That made no sense. They shouldn't have been sent out to 5 people. And I've seen people kind of explain it away in all these different ways, but I think there's no way that it makes sense. And like, the more you look into it and you try to make it make sense, the less it makes sense. Because the young girl Whiskey says, I went to this one last year, and they didn't know each other. So obviously she wasn't at the one the year before. So she doesn't go. So there's no point in sending the box to her, especially after the trial. So they're just plot holes.
Wow, that is gigantic. Yeah, I can't believe I didn't catch that. Someone says ruin it for me.
And someone says the box would have been a good way to pretend they didn't know. No, only if he always sent it. But he clearly, the only way it makes sense is if he sent it every year knowing that she doesn't come. That's the only way that it makes sense.
Ryan Johnson is not a good director. They say. I liked Brick. I mean, if you guys, but of course. And you know what? I think that was eating away at me. Now that I think about it, I do think that was.
There's more than just that one too, and it just annoyed me because, like, I love a real smart kind of, and the twist, of course, was that it wasn't smart, right? That was supposed to be it, because usually it's like a mastermind.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was.
But then that's just a bad writing, because then you're just, oh, he's stupid, oh, he's stupid, oh, he's stupid, you know.
The explanation is, well, I won't say more. But
yeah,
in any
we
case,
totally ruined it for everyone now. But I really liked how it was like a veiled reference to Elon Musk, because this is like, here's a good example of just like obvious capitalist ideology, which is like, because I have made all this money, and it's just like very, you know, I think capitalist ideology is way deeper than this, but this is one that stands out to me that's just obvious, which is like, every time a capitalist makes a ton of money, they see it as confirmation of their genius. And then when they lose money, they see it as a confirmation of everybody else's idiocy. So it was like, because Elon Musk has all this money, they're like, oh, he must be this great genius. But you scratch below the surface and you're like, oh no, he's actually really dumb.
right.
Yeah, and it's like this sort of like cult of personality around particular capitalists. That's, again, super surface level and obvious. And I think the more dangerous capitalist ideology is the one that presents itself as anti-ideology. But anyways, that's
no, stay on that for a moment. Forget about, you know, I'm embarrassed that I didn't think of that plot hole. I was thinking about, because I'm going to give myself this excuse, which is because I was not thinking of it or treating it as a regular murder mystery by the end. I didn't even think through all the clues. I just took it on its word that the clues didn't matter. Like it was just, you know what I mean? But also like, well, anyway, I just said enough about Glass Onion. But back to Rick Roderick, what do you make of this notion that we live in a culture that tries to interpret itself for us, which closes off true critical theory or thinking, and that is aimed at what, in another lecture that Roderick gave, he calls psychoanalysis in reverse, whereas what trying to make what is a conscious self-reflective thought unconscious and non-reflective, and trying to reify, naturalize more and more of what is. Do you think that we do live in such a culture? And if so, how do we as would-be socialists respond to that? And if not, why is that wrong?
What do you mean by culture interprets itself?
Well, he mentioned in the little clip that the television programs attempt to circumvent your critical mind and directly express their meaning on the level of emotions and already accepted stereotypical meanings, so you don't have to interpret because it's already as an example, a career woman will appear on screen and she'll be really harsh with the main character, the male protagonist, and either she's going to that exterior will break down and you'll find the vulnerable woman underneath, or she's the villain. And you don't have to think very much about this because you've seen this to stereotypical characters so many times. This character doesn't require interpretation. She arrives on the scene as a type.
Okay. So I think that there's an easy critique and a hard critique. So I gave you the easy critique before with like, oh, and the movie gave us the easy critique, right? The billionaire is not actually a genius. He's a fucking idiot. And that capitalist ideology says when someone has a ton of money, they must be really smart. But it turns out that he just was slimy and had good lawyers.
Now you are so close to spoiling that thing. Go ahead.
We'll put spoiler alert in the comments. Anyway, so that's the easy critique, right? And you get a lot of movies that have the easy critique in them. Now, the hard critique is how capitalist ideology appears as anti-ideology. So I think what sustains or what appears to explain the world but actually justifies it are things like anti-ideology. So media forms that appear subversive or to like play against these kinds of types. So because we're so used to seeing that character, we don't need to think anymore, right? And that's the easy critique, and we see people make these kinds of criticisms all the time of television and of easy forms of media, and that it's just sucking people's brains out. And don't get me wrong, like, I don't think TikTok is necessarily a great thing to spend a lot of time on. I think it's quite bad. And, it's, in the same way that I think that, drugs should probably be legal, but it's not a good idea to do them a lot. It's the same kind of idea, but it's an easy critique because it resolves into a critique of the working class. It's like, oh, you're consuming all this stupid brain candy, blah, blah, blah. And the real intelligent person is above that. And here's a movie for the real intelligent person. And that's where you need to pay attention to the ideology, because it appears as subversion. Okay, and now I'm about to give a really bad example, because this is not a movie for really intelligent people. But I watch a lot of Disney movies because I've got kids. And everybody told me I needed to see Inside Out because of the kind of research that I do, obviously, on emotion. People are, oh, this is a really, really good one. It's really balanced, and it talks about the full range of emotions, that you need the good with the bad, you need bad memories to have good memories, blah, blah, blah. And what was interesting about that movie is the way that emotion, ideologically, the way that emotion versus reason kind of played out. The world of emotion is good, and that's where your attention needs to be. You need to be focused on balancing these things and having good experiences, bad experiences, blah, blah, blah. And when does everything go wrong, if you remember? It's when the little girl gets an idea. And they've never seen it before. A light bulb goes off on the little control panel, and they're like, oh my God. She has an idea, and she's pursuing it. Like, she's pursuing this idea. And you get this sense that, like, the world of emotion is the place where you need to pay attention, and ideas are what kind of lead you astray. Now, that's obviously a caricature and so on, but it was just very interesting the way that they portrayed this emotion versus reason thing, where reason is the domain where human beings can get ideas in their head and then seek to kind of put them into action in the world, and this is where destruction comes in. And really, what you should do is work on yourself. And you should think about your emotions, and you should take the good with the bad, and you should balance, and you should think about, and I see this with my students. They're like constantly thinking about their own thinking, and they're constantly thinking about their own emotions. And I know a student said to me something like, oh, because I went to school and we learned like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy kind of methods as part of our curriculum, I find that it has made me perfectionist about my own thoughts. Like, that I'm always thinking, oh, I shouldn't have this negative thought, instead of it just being like, yeah, I just thought that bad thought, la la la, carried on, without thinking very much about it. But that's not what you're supposed to do as a good subject. As a good citizen, you are supposed to be self-reflective. You're supposed to always be thinking about your own thinking, be on the lookout for all of these symptoms, and relate yourself to the symptoms, and never, ever be able to get out of this. It's a lifelong process of constantly thinking about your own self. And I think that's the hard ideology to understand, because it appears as subversion, because the movie appeared to be subverting this idea that you should be happy all the time. Or that, this idea of like emotions as this, everybody says this, but it hasn't been true for like fucking 60 years. Oh, we have a stiff upper lip culture. We have a culture in which you should not express emotion. No, like, everybody applauds, they expect tears to come from our policymakers and so on. The demand is to constantly emote, constantly reveal your emotions. In the workplace, they'll give you badges with emojis on them to say like happy, sad, whatever. And management just loves it. And the people are like, yeah, but can I just not like my job and shut the fuck up about it? Like, and just put my head down? No. I say this all the time, but now not only do you have to be exploited, you have to enjoy it. You can't have this part of you that you just keep to yourself and like put on a show. No, that's really bad. That's repression and so on. So I think this is a hard ideology because it appears as anti-ideology. And you think like, oh, as a subversive kind of person, that's the thing to subvert. But you actually have to sort of dig a little deeper and realize that you're being sold a message of subversion that is very much in keeping with the needs of capitalism.
Yeah, I definitely agree with almost all that you said now. But I just would point out that this notion that your emotions and your internal psychological motivations are what need to be taken care of or understood or focused on, and this idea of television that interprets itself that Rick Roderick brought up are not at odds with each other, because
Mm-hmm.
the story about television interpreting itself is a story of circumventing reason and delivering an experience to the viewer where they are not required to think, but only to mind and note their reactions. And with television, what you do is you find the program that is the most narcissistically rewarding, and you watch that. At the end of the day, so the one that requires the least of you, which rewards your sense of self and which makes you feel balanced and good and like you can go to sleep or something. For me, I used to watch the television show Castle, which was obviously just a complete wish fulfillment fantasy. Like, I would imagine myself as Nathan Fillion, this dashing man, and he's a writer who's worth apparently an endless amount of money, could do anything he wants by writing these little mystery novels he got this way. So it's pure wish fulfillment and no depth at all, and certainly doesn't require any critical engagement with the world to consume.
I like that. That's what I watch, because because my whole life, like, I always think, like, why would I want to? Like, my life is so dramatic, and I feel not dramatic. My life is really boring, but I mean, I always feel like I'm on the edge of death, and I think it's because, I don't know, like, growing up, I didn't have a lot of money or whatever, and I'm always thinking tomorrow I'm going to get tossed down into poverty, always in the back of my mind. I'm not going to have enough. I, like, to this day, if there's like peanuts and stuff, I put it in my purse. Like, if there's food around, like, I'm the first person there, and I will put stuff in like a napkin for later. I have this, like, mentality, right? And because I'm always, like, on the edge like that, well, why would I want to watch stuff that makes me edgy before I go to bed? I want to, like, I don't even want a storyline necessarily. I want, like, a feeling.
Yeah, but you're obviously, super engaged, and you see all the plot holes. You don't sell yourself short. Here's what I'll say is that, okay, there's this notion that Lenin put forward that, the working class will, beaten down by grueling work, the working class will never get beyond trade union consciousness. That's what Lenin says, right? And instead, the intellectual vanguard, whether they consist of unique workers or people from other classes, from the bourgeois class, or petty bourgeois intellectuals, they will have to create the ideology of socialism and the tactics and strategic thinking of socialism, and bring that to the workers through a vanguard party, right? So let's just pretend for a moment that we can accept this idea. The trouble is that none of the people in that party are able to think anymore, because we live in a culture where for them, all these the cognitive behavioral therapy is radical politics, or so you see what I mean? It's like it's the one of the things that I think of sublation being for. One of the reasons we're doing sublation is not necessarily to go out to people in factories and convince them to organize. So they're going to organize or not, regardless of what I put up on YouTube. We're aiming at college students most of the time, or professors even. These are the people who are supposed to have the time to develop into intellectuals and into a radical vanguard, and we can barely think because of not just because of some moral failing, but because of the development of culture and technology in combination to constrain the intellectuals. So, I take seriously Marx's injunction that the educator needs to educate themselves. So what do you make of that?
I don't know. I'm really bad on, like, socialist tactics and so on. Like, I do understand that, you can have spontaneous movements of the working class, but if there's no organization beyond that, they won't go anywhere. But I'm wondering, just with what you mentioned a second ago, where you said, cognitive behavioral therapy appears as radical politics. And like this stuff is just everywhere. It just saturates movements. It's like wellness culture. And I wonder if it's because it's in the interests of those people who tend to see themselves as, or be able to be in the position to take the lead, that this kind of politics speaks to them more than it does, maybe other sections of society, because it's in their interest. And it's in
their interest because they're bourgeois subjects, because they can't see beyond the horizon of the bourgeois society. So then it seems to be in their interest to placate the masses and to limit our thinking.
It's not even just in their interest. It's like, it's not just in their interest, like in the sense that they can't see beyond the horizon, and so they see the self as the limit. That's true. But also it's in their interest in the sense that it's a job creator for a lot of middle class people. Like, so I remember I went to, I'll never forget this. Like I'm like a fish out of water in a lot of places where people invite me by mistake and they realize what they get and they're like, how do we get rid of
you have this great disguise where you get color coordinated sweaters. Someone pointed out it was neither a shirt nor a blouse, but a sweater, right? And the little paintings in the background. You look so like innocent and sweet. And how would anyone know that you were a bomb thrower? But anyway,
yeah, they expect like a self-help session and they get Lenin.
That's right.
This has happened a few times, and I didn't see like the looks of horror across the room. But anyways, there was one time that I was actually invited to apply for some funding, and I'm just terrible at this kind of thing. I'm so bad at it. Anyways, and it was very much like this sort of progressive funder that saw himself as, billionaire kind of person, but philanthropic, sees himself as very left-wing kind of person. And I was invited along with a few other people to kind of pitch for some funding to do a project. And a lot of the people that were there were like philosophy graduates, psychology graduates, and philosophy has this issue now where, and psychology, but philosophy more so, where it's like, well, we have to have employability, right? You can't just like teach students philosophy and then send them out into the world if they can't then get a job and pay back their student loans. And so philosophy has this sort of existential crisis where it's like, okay, well, what do we do? And it was interesting because this person had clearly come out of that one person that was there had come out of that kind of trajectory. And she was like, what we really need to do, and what my project, and I think she got it funded too. What we really need to do is teach businesses ethics, because they're acting unethically. And I think the philosophy of ethics has a lot to say here. And it sounded all very left wing. Like it was like they're, this example of this business, this bad thing. And I was just sitting there, and you're supposed to be nice, right? But I was like, they're not doing this because they don't know it's bad. What the fuck? And I actually said that, and they were like, well, blah, blah, blah. And so she wanted to create these training programs in philosophy of ethics that she was going to sell to all these businesses. And of course, the businesses love it because it's like, yeah, my workers, their ethics are real bad, and look, I have committed to this ethical program. All of our new workers, they have to take this, thing in ethics. And so in that way, it's kind of in the interest of these sort of graduates to put out to make a purpose for themselves. Right. And I'm sure she'd be very successful doing that. And you have tons of this stuff that comes in where people are like, you didn't know it was a problem before, but I'm here to tell you that actually this is the problem and I've got the solution. And an enormous amount of like psychology graduates are like that. I know I mark a lot of dissertations that are like finding some problem that with like the way that people feed their children with a spoon. And I'm going to have this whole thing, this new campaign that ends spoon feeding once and for all. And it's just like, and then it's like, oh, well, what's the big deal? It's just, why shouldn't people not spoon feed? Because then it's like, and you shouldn't spoon feed, and you should do this, and you should do that. And the working class is like, who the fuck are these people? Leave me alone.
All right, but corporate America, I mean, I hate to, I'm not just against corporate America. I'm not just against corporations. I understand corporations develop because of the tendency for capitalism to concentrate, or for capital to concentrate in. And so I don't take an anti-corporate line. However, if you come up through the arts, right, you know that if you want to be an artist, an actual artist, you will have to make sacrifices when it comes to your financial future, because the big jobs that will be available to you are going to crush whatever it is that you like about art, and diminish what you do to the level of copy, for instance, if you're a writer. So like, you go into to get a creative writing degree, but if you end up writing copy for a big health insurance company, you're not going to be a great writer. You're not even going to be a good writer. Well, the same thing's true with philosophy. If you go through the philosophy department and you say, well, I want to get a corporate job and get 6 figures or more a year, yeah, you're going to be really a dumb philosopher. You're not going to be able to think the thought of, oh, well, the problem, may go beyond just not understanding, what is ethical. I mean, you might not, you're going to have to say, oh yeah, we should just remain on the level of Socrates and assume that the trouble is we don't know what is just. And not only that, but be dumber than that, because we should just assume that if we write a paper filled with jargon for some corporation, then everyone will know what it is to be just. Right. So yeah, it's the tradition of the humanities and is, I think, radical itself, but it gets, through the culture industry, through the industrialization of the humanities, it gets debased. And that's what you're experiencing, what you're talking about. And of course, people who have invested in that kind of education want to be employed, and they want to be employed based doing what they've learned how to do. But, and then, go from there. It's like, and if you are a successful artist, who gets elevated in the world of art, and what and how much of a rat race is that, and how much poverty is there, and how unequal is all of that. And it's incredibly, the level of inequality in the arts, it just has been taken for granted forever that most people are going to starve, and the delusion is, the best minds, best artists will rise to the top or whatever. But anyway, I'm sorry, I'm now ranting.
Oh, no. Well, I think it's important to sort of clarify that, like, obviously, then you have a ton of people that are going through universities and so on with liberal arts educations and humanities education and so on. And I'm not, like, I am part of that. I teach sociology, right? And I'm not saying that they're all bad and they're all bad people. I'm saying that it's created this situation where, in order to survive, you have to sort of locate problems in the world that you say you're going to solve. You have to fit yourself into the matrix. You have to fit yourself into things, into the world as it is. And this creates a situation. But it also creates a situation where the people, because what we started out talking about was like the vanguard, but the people who see themselves as leaders, it kind of transforms that function not as a position of leadership or just sort of like helping to think through what we have going on, but rather to create a kind of social problems class, a class of people who attend to the problems of the poor, and who advocate on their behalf in terms of more welfare state funding or social programs or whatever. And it tends to have more of a philanthropic kind of outlook. And I don't know, just to give you an example of this, like there was on my family's reserve, we had this long ongoing kind of court case where the lines that we had agreed and signed a treaty around had been disobeyed. And they took some of our land, and some of it, I'm not exactly sure how it worked out, but something to do with an energy company that was using our land and making all of this money, and they agreed to cut us into the money. So we all got a payout in 2014 of $20,000, and we're supposed to get it again, but it wasn't as clear as I thought it was, which is a shame because I was kind of counting on that. Anyway, but so after a long period of time, we argued for this. And then when it came to actually getting the money, a lot of people were in the membership were saying, well, look, we shouldn't actually give people this money. It should go to, something for the community. And I was like, oh my God, that money's going to go to like the social problems class, to like administering to problems. But the problems themselves are like caused by poverty and distance from mainstream freedoms and work and the complicated bureaucratic process that winds up happening when you leave the reserve, and so on and so on. Anyways, the problems are very complex, but it was like, oh, we'll just like give the money to the people above because we don't trust the people on the ground that they will actually spend that money correctly. But when you trust people as a subject and you see them as subjects, not as philanthropic objects, then doesn't mean they're always going to make the right choices. Doesn't mean they're always going to do the right thing, but you trust them even to make mistakes, right? And the idea was, and that was a moment where I realized, like, the people on the reserve were being seen as a philanthropic object that to be attended to. And luckily, we had a big vote where everybody had a say, even the philanthropic objects, and they wanted the money. And yes, some people drank the money. And some people, a lot of people, built themselves comfortable homes. I put a down payment on my house that I own, my tiny little house, and I have an ex-council house. That I use that money for that. And I bought a little piece of Britain. I like that idea. Like they came and took that, and I was like, I took it back with a tiny little bit of their profits and their like colonization or whatever. But that's the idea, right? It's like, it's this attitude that develops is one of, rather than seeing yourself as part of it, seeing everyone as like subjects, and respecting people as subjects, even if people will make a mistake, even if you don't always agree with them, and seeing people as objects and to be cared for and attended to. And I think that's what's happened here, is that the outlook tends to be one of caring, and then people don't like that. They don't like being seen as objects, and they tend to push back against that. And then you have a lot of animosity that develops between like the coastal regions and the rural regions, where it's like, I'm here for you to like, I'm trying to help you. How dare you? You're voting against your own interests. And it's like, well, I'm not your object. So you get a lot of the tension that plays out. And I think part of that is this idea of like, there are conflicting interests that have developed between the kind of humanities graduates, I suppose, the social program kind of people, and the remainder of the working class. And I think this is part of it's an enormous tension, I think, also in the United States as well.
Listen, we've gone well over an hour.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say that when it comes to our patrons, our pledge to them in 2023 is to treat them as subjects and not as objects. And part of the way that we're going to do that is we've got the research project pamphlet series coming out. The first one has arrived. I'm going to run this clip. So, look at that. My pop filter fell. Again, here it is. Left Adjacent by Alfie Bound. This is the first of at least 12 pamphlets. If you are a patron at the right level, you'll receive one of these in the mail each month, and that will make you into a subject. You can just buy this pamphlet series, and then you read it and go, now I'm activated. I am interpreting the world for myself. And I can see what garbage these things are for myself, or whatever you decide about these pamphlets. But that is our pledge. We're going to be trying to, in fact, the idea of the research project is we're going to try to rethink the left, rethink the project of socialism, break all thought taboos, and take on and tackle problems which are actually problems for us, not just to offer up answers that we've already developed in advance. So look forward to that. Anything else you want to say here at the end, Ashley, before we?
No, I just started arguing with people in the comments. So
Ashley, these are our people. No, we should definitely argue with them. So if you'd like to continue watching, in about 5 to 10 minutes, we'll start our second stream for patrons. There is a link to it in the description of this live stream. I will also post a link to it as a comment right before we start the new stream. I'm going to go refill my coffee cup. And thank you all for watching today. And Ashley, stop arguing with people in the comments. We will be answering comments throughout the stream in the Patreon. We'll be answering what's called viewer mail. Again, thanks for watching today, folks.
Thank you.
Well, actually, I'm going to run the little out clip, which is the same as
in the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such